But right now, it's my great pleasure to introduce our first sort of formal session of the day. This is one we're really excited about. This is our Voices of Canadian Leadership segment for day 2. I'm really pleased to introduce Carol Anne Hilton, who is CEO and founder of the Indigenomics Institute. She's actually here with us in the studio, which is fantastic. She's flown all this way to be here to share her insights. I can't wait to hear them. I'm going to read a bit about Carol Anne if you haven't had a chance to read about her or know about her. She's founder of the Indigenomics Institute, and today she's going to talk about in the Indigenous economy in Canada, the role that you as institutional players, institutional investors can play in the well-being and economic empowerment of Indigenous people. And she's going to talk a bit about her work and the scope of the Indigenous economy in Canada today. So welcome, Carol Anne. It's so lovely to meet you. Thank you for traveling here all the way from BC. And I'm going to hand things over to you to share your thoughts.
Great, thank you. It's good to be here this morning, and thank you for your leadership in bringing this conversation together. Uklas is Carol Anne Hilton. I'm new channel from the Vancouver Island community of Heshkwet. What is important to me to come here today is to really begin to pay attention to what it is that we're seeing. And if we're not seeing it, how do we gain the information that's required to support our decision making today? My work in Indigenomics is developing this concept of Indigenomics essentially as modern, constructive, generative economic design. So what is important in that concept is that Indigenomics serves as a platform to be able to bring and align this country together in a new narrative. What I understand is that Canada, and to be able to build from this truth is important, that Canada was built through the lens of the Indian problem. If we understand that concept of the Indian problem, essentially we can understand that policies, regulations, and the economy were built from that perspective. So in this concept of the Indian problem, what we see is that the extermination of indigeneity was an original narrative. Canada was built on the systemic exclusion of Indigenous peoples. And when we can look at building a Canada that is built on the inclusion of Indigenous peoples from that economic perspective, that's really what Indigenomics is a platform for constructive economic design. So now being able to understand that the history of economic exclusion is the cause of what we would describe as the socioeconomic gap today. So what is important to me in my work is that there's too much research that describes the socioeconomic gap of Indigenous peoples, that essentially to begin to measure Indigenous economic strength, Indigenous economic outcomes, and Indigenous economic empowerment is a new narrative that requires data to support that decision making. So I wrote a book called Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table. And essentially the first component of it is the distinction of Indigenous worldview and how that's differing from a mainstream worldview and how that expresses itself through economy. Next, I look at the historical development of Canada and that systemic exclusion and lay the foundation that Indigenous peoples today have built a growing, distinct economy that requires paying attention to. So it's in being able to form this understanding of the growing strength of the Indigenous economy, in that a TD economic report out of 2016 identified the potential size of the Indigenous economy to be 30 billion. The estimate came out and it was actually 32 billion. So when you look at the estimates of the rudimentary description and metrics of the growth of the Indigenous economy, we saw in 2010, the size of the Indigenous economy was closer to 10 billion. Then it went to 16 and then 32. So the concept of the Indigenomics Institute is essentially to future pace the target and the outcome of Indigenous economic design to a target of $100 billion annual Indigenous economy. And of course, while that is pre-COVID estimate, if you look to the size of the Canadian Indigenous population, it makes up just under 5% of the overall Canadian population. If you look at a ratio of aligning the size of that population to the size of the economy, we could potentially, as 5% of the population, generate $100 billion in Indigenous economic activity. So it is not only possible, but it is essential to be able to measure Indigenous economic strength, measure Indigenous input and impact. I draw your attention specifically to two reports. The first being an Atlantic regional study that identified the collective Indigenous nations contributed close to $3 billion annually of Indigenous economic activity to the regional GDP. Secondly, there's a Manitoba 2018 study that identified Indigenous economic contribution close to $9 billion annually of Indigenous economic activity. So I posit essentially that if each region were to identify Indigenous economic activity and impact to the larger regional economy, so if we looked at Saskatchewan, Alberta, BC, the territories, et cetera, Quebec, of course, and then did the similar metrics, I posit that we would essentially come close to $100 billion in Indigenous economic activity based on the similar structures of those reports. So in understanding that this is not only possible, what is important to me in future pacing the economic strength of Indigenous economy is that you make different decisions at a $32 billion Indigenous economy in 2016. So if you were not aware that the size of the Indigenous economy was 32 billion, considering that that number is close to being dated now, what you see is that we would make different decisions collectively at a $100 billion Indigenous target of achievement than we would at 32 billion. And that's really what Indigenomics Institute is driving within this $100 billion Indigenous economy. So to be able to future pace that is not only possible, but we as Canadians, as institutions, as corporations and governments need to be paying attention to the tools, the investment, and the infrastructure into the Indigenous economy. I further position the concept that the Indigenous economy cannot exist solely within government programs and services. When I sat on the Canadian Economic Growth Council, I saw the demonstration of the concept of the Indigenous spend, so the entire transfer of Indigenous dollars into communities within the 2016 year. So what I saw was that there was 94% of activity that could be described as kind of management, social, health, education dollars, and that 2% had been earmarked for, 3% had been earmarked for reconciliation activities, and 2% only had been earmarked specifically for economic development. So that is a classic case of the economic cart trying to pull that social. So realizing the inequality in that equation, what becomes important to me to understand is that we need a fiscal equation in this country steeped in reconciliation. So I also position this concept of indigenomics that where reconciliation must occur is within the fiscal equation of this country. So the investment, the tools, the infrastructure of the Indigenous economy, that is really the hotspot or the center point of being able to align private, public, and nation building in the design of the Indigenous economy overall. At the Institute, I've established a concept called the Indigenomics economic mix, which is essentially 12 levers to support the growth and design of the Indigenous economy itself. So these hotspots include examples such as trade, procurement, entrepreneurship, equity, capital, technology, clean energy as examples. So when we see clean energy, let's pull that example. When we see clean energy, we see that close to 2/3 of the 630 plus nations in Canada all have clean energy projects. So that's why we can begin to demonstrate that as a hotspot within the Indigenous economy, where every single day we see this constant narrative now of equity ownership in major projects within this country. Some of you may have seen the ongoing demonstration or narrative of high conflict Indigenous projects. What becomes important in that is to understand Indigenous ability to facilitate de-risking of projects means early engagement, early consultation, and early consent. So it's when Indigenous peoples are able to better manage risk within their territories, that's when we see also a higher degree of equity ownership that supports the narrative of allowing a project of such a large nature to go through a territory. So it's in beginning to understand examples such as these that in my work, I also introduce this concept that Indigenous peoples are the only ones who have had to actually fight for the right to an economy here in Canada. So if you look to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, we see this concept introduced within it as a framework is to see Indigenous peoples as having the right to self-determination, the right to continue as people, and the right to an economy. It's in my own historical understanding that as a Nuu-chah-nulth person from Vancouver Island, we were ocean people. So essentially the ocean was our garden. Through the system of regulations and licensing, we were an ocean people. So we took Canada to court and said that we had lost our right to an economy. So in that, what we were asking for was essentially the right to be able to sell fish. So again, we see that narrative still today on the other side of the country. And what is important in that is that the construct of commerce, we've had to fight for that space to be able to actually have a functioning economy. So we won that court case and won the modern right to sell fish. However, we exist in a country that said you do not have the modern right to exchange money for fish. So we can't have it both ways. We can't be measuring the socioeconomic gap and measuring economic strength. It's important also in naming that as a specific example is that in our court case, we demonstrated through the eyes of the first boats that came through our territory, who were funded by the Spanish Crown, that essentially what they observed, witnessed, and wrote down was on behalf of the Spanish Crown. So it was the highest level of evidence. And what they acknowledged was that we brought fish to those boats upon first contact. And what we were able to argue was that that was actually a commercial function and that the translation of that also meant to be able to have a modern functioning commerce established today. So examples such as that, it really begins to demonstrate this right to an economy is also how we've been able to build the success of Indigenous economic design today. So in understanding examples such as these, Indigenous economic strength and moving towards a $100 billion Indigenous economy is largely because we have been able to be successful in spite of the Indian Act. So in my book called Indigenomics, Taking a Seat at the Economic Table, what I have also been able to demonstrate is that there is close to 275 cases where Indigenous peoples have won their right to either exist, undertake traditional activities, or establish the requirement of the relationship with states and regions. So those types of things is where the duty to consult as examples have come from, and what I call established economic space. So it's in this new economic space that has been facilitated is really where the opportunity is. In being able to demonstrate in this growing economic space, we see that the capitalization of the Indigenous economy is a central tenet of the growth of the Indigenous economy today. So I refer to the work of the National Aboriginal Capital Association, where the demonstration of the growth of Indigenous businesses, of whether that's through economic development corporations or First Nations entrepreneurship, where we see the gap in capital that is required to grow the ever-evolving strength of the capital requirement of the Indigenous economy. So beginning to demonstrate that there's a capital gap that exists, I return to the point that essentially the Indigenous economy cannot exist solely within government programs and services. So it's in this realization that if we externalize the concept of the growth of Indigenous economy, then no one is in particular responsible for it. If we continue to measure socioeconomic gap, what we see is the deficit thinking that allows a lack of action. Instead, if we begin to measure Indigenous economic strength, that is the place to begin to pay attention to. The construct of the space of the capitalization of the Indigenous economy is really the essential component of what it means to play Indigenomics. To be able to engage in the design, the construct, and the generative nature of the Indigenous economy, if you have not been engaged within the visibility of this growing strength of the Indigenous economy, that is really the core message, is that the essence of being able to support it, to look at it from a design perspective, and to be able to demonstrate the uptake in the capitalization of the Indigenous economy as a central construct of reconciliation. So to be able to determine the visibility and the accountability of the Indigenous economic construct, or an actual number of growth, what becomes important in that to me is to be able to demonstrate clear lines of action and to be able to understand that an uptake in Indigenous economic activity at the local level needs to be able to be demonstrated. So my work at the Indigenomics essentially started as a hashtag of Indigenomics. So essentially what I was able to do was facilitate a space and a thread of content that demonstrated the growth of Indigenous business, the experience of conflict within that growth, and to demonstrate stories about Indigenous business success. So when we understand and are able to bring visibility to Indigenous business success, that's really the intention of it as a hashtag. As a platform, it's intended to be able to support Indigenous economic design. So again, this concept of taking a seat at the economic table, this is the new reality. So Canada was built on systemic Indigenous economic exclusion. And now the question that is in front of us as a country is, how do we build Indigenous economic inclusion into the next 150 plus years of this country? So that is the question, and that is what being able to pay attention to that as a design question within your institutions, organizations, corporations, governments, is really what the concept of Indigenomics is facilitating today. I bring your attention also to the return to this concept of the implementation of United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. So the concept that I hear often is, well, aren't Indigenous rights the same as human rights? If that is the same, then essentially we wouldn't have the need for the UNDRIP framework. In having the need for the UNDRIP framework is essentially that those Indigenous rights have not been allowed the space to be able to be recognized. So that right to an economy is something that has grown into how we've been able to be successful in spite of the Indian Act. So I bring your attention to the Indian Act itself. I position essentially that 630 plus nations in this country have all been affected by the Indian Act. While I realize that some nations have signed historical treaties, some nations are described as self-governing, and to be able to understand modern treaty and governing systems, it is still true that of every single nation has been negatively impacted by the Indian Act itself over time. I also position that every single Canadian has been negatively impacted by the Indian Act itself and the constructs within it that establish the conditions for economic regression. So being able to facilitate this concept of Indian Act economics, I position that Canada deserves better than the Indian Act. I also, in saying that every single person in this country has been negatively impacted by the Indian Act, what becomes important to that is building a narrative that Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses. In being able to demonstrate this, that we have come from economic regression, this system of economic isolation. So the isolation from lands, resources, identity, culture, to utilizing business as a way to return to that, that is something significant, that we are establishing Indigenous economic growth, not for the sake of growth, but essentially for the sake of that realignment of cultural identity, continuation, and our ability to facilitate inclusion at the economic table of this country. So this construct of having a seat at the economic table, I bring to this concept visibility. So it is time to be able to look at Indigenous inclusion within our entities and within our processes, and to be able to bring those understanding of where Indigenous economic hotspots are happening and the development of those hotspots. So again, I return to this concept of equity ownership. Whether it's through pipelines or rail lines, I think we just saw that through the concept of the Alberta to Alaska Rail this past week, where the demonstration of equity on the table, again, is something to begin to paying attention to. So that is literally having a seat at the economic table and beginning to demonstrate that what that means to have a seat at the economic table means essentially the capitalization of the Indigenous economy today. So those are some of the aspects I wanted to be able to demonstrate in not only the concept of Indigenomics, bringing visibility to economic strength, and to begin to design our financial investment into the realization that it's a strategic advantage that when the Indigenous economy does well, it supports Canada's GDP as well. Those are some of the things I wanted to be able to cover. I'm not sure how much time I have left.
Well, we're already getting quite a few questions for you, so I really want to have an opportunity to take them. People are typing madly away on our chat system, but I think people are sort of formulating, but I have lots. That was fascinating. Thank you so much, Carol Anne. I think my question is, you talked about a new fiscal equation. You talked about a figure of like $100 billion and sort of aiming that high. I'd love to get a sense, like, what does that new fiscal equation look like? Like, how do you break it down? Like, can you break it down, or, dig a little deeper into that?
Yeah, for sure. And I think that I just saw this number come out of the National Aboriginal Capital Corporation Association, which demonstrated for every dollar invested, created $1.40 in return within the local region. So that's one example of that. We can continue within this story of socioeconomic gap, and that comes from the deficit perspective of how far behind Indigenous communities are, or we can begin to focus on Indigenous economic strength. There's a number of, I look to the north, particularly in the Yukon, and I heard this number that I think was very powerful. That as self-governing nations, the number of First Nations in the Yukon, the collective investment in dollars was larger than the entirety of the Yukon government itself. That's a demonstration of Indigenous economic and financial presence. So what is important to me is the demonstration of Indigenous peoples are economic powerhouses, and our ability to facilitate and make decisions from that. That's really about Indigenomics as economic design.
Great. I have a question. This is from Jason Stefanelli. Thanks, Jason. First Nation communities understand the need of encouraging resource development to better their own communities. Once the infrastructure, roads, et cetera, gets built, the final phase would seem to be resource development. If so, would this involve some sort of impact benefit agreement where the First Nation communities would receive royalty payments? How should Canada balance the resource development with the environmental impacts? It's a lot in there. What do you think?
That is a lot in there. I like this concept that resources don't have value until they reach the market. So understanding that from the impact benefit, what we're seeing is much more stronger agreements that are supporting Indigenous participation within the project. I like this concept of collaborative consent, where there's a longer stream of engagement and a larger series of questions to get to yes or no within, that allows engagement and relationship building at a deeper level. So expanding just away from a simple yes/no answer of a project to a series of risk management, I think that is also where we're seeing high levels of conflict, is where nations are not able to manage risk at a local level in the same way as what the project has been designated from a regulatory perspective. So I think examples such as the upcoming Impact Assessment Council and the structures of that, what is required is a shift in approach of risk management from the nation's perspective, earlier engagement both within the design of risk and the financial aspect are two areas that we're seeing shifts, again, largely within the inclusion of equity ownership within projects.
So I have another question. So we talked before our discussion here today, and so you know who our audience is. We've got pension investors, asset managers, people that invest on behalf of plan members, et cetera. What's your call to action for institutional investors?
Absolutely. For my main message is essentially that you need to be advised on the growing Indigenous economic strength in this country. You need to be advised on Indigenous economic activity that's happening locally. I've established this concept of the Indigenomics economic mix as constructs to support the visualization of Indigenous economic strength. Inclusion of Indigenous peoples within boards, I think, is a new uptake in this visual reality of economic reconciliation. Indigenous advisories within your system. You need to see Brown people at the table to be able to support both Indigenous economic inclusion and this understanding of the visibility of Indigenous economic strength. It is a simple truth today that the inclusion of Indigenous peoples is a strategic advantage. So that really is the opportunity. You're allowing the uptake of that strategic advantage of the inclusion of Indigenous people, or you're not paying attention to it. And I think that's simple. We need to be advised on Indigenous economic local strength, and we need to be advised on that visibility of economic activity.
That is absolutely amazing. And I have so enjoyed speaking with you and hearing from you here today. I think what I'd like to do on Discord is add some information about your book or anything else that you have that we could share with our audience here today. That would be absolutely fantastic. So maybe we can follow up with Carol Anne after and get a link to your book if it's on Amazon or anything, and put that in, because I think we've got a lot of people listening today, and these have been very enlightening and very helpful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having
I wish we
me.
could have a lot of applause right now for you, but there's, yes, yay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. So Carol Anne has set us up wonderfully for the next theme that we're going to address for the next couple of sessions. Carol Anne started talking to us about the scope of the Indigenous economy here in Canada, where that fits in the United Nations, views on Indigenous economics and Indigenous rights, and what we can do about it, what you can do about it as institutional investors. And we're going to continue that conversation about really investing for societal change by moving into the area of impact investing.